You won't find bodies at Titanic. You won't find skeletons. The bones actually dissolve into solution very rapidly at that depth. What anybody who's explored the wreck finds is pairs of shoes.
One of the few tragedies that everyone everywhere is aware of is the sinking of the Titanic. Though the RMS Titanic went down on April 14th of 1912, the wreckage of the doomed ship was not discovered until 1985 off the coast of Newfoundland. While much of the ship had naturally perished after sitting for decades at sea, divers were still able to rescue and preserve a number of amazing and even terrifying items. Join us as we have a look at 15 terrifying things recovered from the Titanic. Number 1. Human remains, including bones and teeth. During the recovery efforts after the sinking of the Titanic, many bodies were recovered from the ocean, but not all of them could be identified. Some of the remains were in such poor condition that identification was impossible, while others were never claimed by family members. Many of these unidentifiable remains were buried in cemeteries near the recovery sites, such as Halifax, Nova Scotia, where a number of victims would be buried in Fairview Lawn Cemetery. Some of those remains were sent back to their place of origin for burial, but still, many remains were never claimed and were buried in unmarked graves. The identification of the remains was a difficult task, and it was not always successful. In many cases, the remains were in a state of decomposition, and the identification was based on clothing, personal items, or other physical characteristics. In addition to the remains that were never identified, there were also cases of misidentification. Some remains would be misidentified due to confusion or lack of information, which would lead to families receiving the wrong remains or burying the wrong person. This caused further pain and suffering for the families who were already dealing with the loss of their loved ones. In recent years, advances in DNA technology has allowed for the identification of some of the remains of Titanic's victims. In 2007, the remains of 2 victims were exhumed from Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax and were identified using DNA testing. It's a tragic fact that many of the victims of the Titanic disaster were never identified, and their families never knew what happened to them. It serves as a reminder of the devastating loss of life that occurred on that fateful night. Number 2. An 18-karat gold necklace. On April the 15th of 2017, the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas opened Titanic, the Artifact Exhibition, organized by Premier Exhibitions to commemorate the 105th anniversary of the Titanic sinking to its eternal icy home. Amongst the many items on display was a locket that was made out of 18-karat gold belonging to a passenger named Virginia Estelle McDowell Clark. Virginia and her husband Walter boarded the Titanic in order to return to their home in Los Angeles. They had spent their belated honeymoon in Europe and were eager to return home so that they could celebrate their son's 2nd birthday with him. The Clarks were first-class passengers aboard the ship, according to Alexandria Klingelhofer, a curator for Premier Exhibitions, and had actually cut their honeymoon short in order to be able to return home. Virginia and Walter, like most of the other passengers, likely assumed that they were perfectly safe on this massive ocean liner and would be reunited with their son in no time. After all, the ship was advertised as completely unsinkable, and most passengers didn't question the claim before boarding. Unfortunately, Virginia was the only one of the Clarks to return home, and only because of her husband's sacrifice. Virginia was alone in her cabin when the ship collided with an iceberg in the northern Atlantic Ocean, and when she felt the impact, she went straight to Walter, who was in the lounge playing cards with some other men, apparently unfazed by the vibrations that he must have felt from the collision. When the couple realized what had occurred, they then rushed to the lifeboats, hoping that both of them would be able to make it to safety. Women and children were allowed to board the lifeboats before anyone else, as we all know from the film, and it was no different in real life. Virginia and Walter, just like Rose and Jack, were separated while he ensured that his wife was on the lifeboat and on her way to safety. They hoped to be reunited one day, but that simply never happened. Number 3. A doll's head. A doll that survived the Titanic and was recovered from the seafloor 65 years later is up for auction once again, according to its current owner. Only the head of Eva Hart's favorite doll, which she had to leave behind in her berth when she fled the sinking ship, remains. Captain Abel Frederico Nogueras of the shipping company Argan Bell discovered the doll 41 years ago, 2,000 meters underwater, halfway across the Atlantic between Southampton, UK, and New York City. And he kept it for the next 15 years until his death. Teresa Martin, a collector from the province of Huelva in Spain's far southwest, contacted Eva Hart and reached an agreement which allowed her to keep the doll. Eva died in 1996, never seeing her doll again, but content with the knowledge that she had been discovered. Eva had always made reference to the doll when interviewed about her ordeal on the Titanic and her survival after the luxury ocean liner sank on its maiden voyage before the doll was recovered. A sailor rescued this disturbing doll's head from the bottom of the Atlantic in 1977. The porcelain figure, dragged up from a depth of 6,561 feet, was initially thought to be a rock, but once its finder realized that it was a doll's head, he treasured it until his death in 1992. The porcelain head is the exact shape of the Schöne and Hofmeister 1906 mold, and this rare doll is known to have survived the Titanic. After years in a museum in Spain, the head was then auctioned off for €650 in 2018 on an auction site. Number 4. Vials of perfume. These perfume vials discovered in a closed pouch were another extraordinary find by the RMS Titanic Inc. team. Dick Barton, a salvage expert, explained to ABC News how they didn't know what they had found until they got to the surface. When Barton and his team opened the pouch in question, they discovered that it contained an entire lab of Edwardian perfume. The pouch contained 62 perfume vials, which researchers believe belonged to a first-class passenger, 47-year-old perfume maker Adolf Saffold. When Saffold abandoned the ship, he left the samples behind, and he was one of the fortunate few who made it to safety. Legacy 1912, a fragrance by Eau de Perfume that is said to smell like delicate lemon and Neuralis, alongside blushing rose and warm sheer amber, would be created as a result of this discovery. Number 5. A set of keys to a cabin that was never found. In another shocking revelation, a set of keys to a cabin that was never found were also recovered from the Titanic. This is surprising because it raises questions about the fate of the passengers who occupied that cabin and what actually happened to them. The keys would suggest that the cabin was occupied at the time of the sinking, and the fact that it was never found implies that the cabin and its occupants were lost in the disaster. It is possible that the keys were recovered from the wreckage or from belongings of a survivor or victim, but it's not confirmed that such keys were ever found. It could also be that the cabin was not occupied at the time of the sinking, but the keys were still recovered and the cabin never found. It's worth mentioning that many cabins and the areas of the ship were never found, and it's likely that those areas were completely destroyed during the sinking or simply lost to the ocean. The discovery of keys to a cabin that was never found would raise many questions and could potentially provide new information about the disaster. Number 6. A pair of gold cufflinks with the initials JH. These were considered significant discoveries because they provided a personal and tangible connection to the passengers or crew members on board the Titanic. The fact that the cufflinks are made of gold and have initials engraved on them would suggest that they belong to a person of wealth or importance who was on board the ship. The discovery of these cufflinks has raised many questions about their owner and their fate. For example, were they wealthy businessmen or high-ranking crew members? Did they have a family or loved ones who were also on board the ship? And what were their thoughts and feelings as the ship was sinking? To answer these questions could give us a glimpse into the personal lives of the passengers and crew members on board the Titanic and provide a much more human perspective on the entire disaster. Plus, the discovery of these cufflinks was also significant in terms of its historical context to the disaster. The Titanic was considered a grand and luxurious ship, and the fact that these gold cufflinks were recovered from the wreckage serves as a reminder of the opulence and grandeur of the ship itself and the wealth and status of its passengers. Number 7. A pair of leather boots belonging to a crew member. These boots were a shocking find because they humanized the disaster and brought to mind the crew members who lost their lives while trying to save passengers. The boots would suggest that the crew member was on duty at the time of the sinking and was likely involved in evacuation efforts. It is possible that these boots were recovered from the wreckage or from the remains of the crew member. The discovery of this item served as a reminder of the sacrifices and bravery of the crew members during the disaster, and also gave a glimpse into the conditions on board the ship and the practical considerations of the crew members who were trying to save lives. Finally, the discovery of a pair of leather boots belonging to a crew member is a powerful reminder of the human cost of the disaster and provides a personal connection to the crew members who lost their lives while trying to save others who were on the Titanic. Number 8. The deck bell rung to warn passengers. The deck bell that was rung by Frederick Fleet is an important artifact from the Titanic disaster. The bell would be used on the crow's nest of the ship and would be rung to signal the presence of an obstacle ahead. In this case, the iceberg that the Titanic struck on April the 15th of 1912. The bell would be recovered from the wreckage of the Titanic in the early 1990s by RMS Titanic Inc., the company that held the rights to salvage the wreckage, and it was later donated to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. The bell is considered an important historical artifact as it is one of the very few remaining pieces of equipment from the crow's nest, and it serves as a tangible reminder of the tragic events that occurred on the night of the sinking. The bell is also a reminder of the role of crew members in the disaster and the actions that were taken by the lookouts in order to warn the bridge of the obstacle ahead. Number 9. A handwritten account of the lifeboat recovery. An unidentified oceanic passenger's handwritten account of the lifeboat recovery describes the gruesome discovery of 3 corpses. According to the report, one corpse was wearing a dinner jacket, and the bodies of 2 Titanic firemen were wedged underneath the lifeboat seats. One of the corpse's arms had come off into the hands of the Oceanic's boarding officer, and according to the note, a woman's ring was also discovered on the lifeboat. It's an incredibly graphic account of the recovery, auctioneer Andrew Aldridge of Henry Aldridge & Son told FoxNews.com. The Titanic was dubbed the Ship of Dreams, but this is the Ship of Nightmares. It represents the most horrific aspects of a disaster. A number of Titanic passengers made it to the collapsible A lifeboat when it washed off the ship's deck and partially submerged, but not all of them survived. When the survivors of collapsible A were picked up by another lifeboat, the bodies discovered by Oceanic were left on the lifeboat. Thompson Beatty, a Titanic first-class passenger, would be identified as the corpse in the dinner jacket. According to Encyclopedia Titanica, the wedding ring belonged to Swedish passenger Elin Gerda Lindell, who briefly reached collapsible A before drowning. Elin's ring was held by her husband, Edvard, before he died on collapsible A, and his body was never found. Number 10. The hull of the Titanic. The hull of the RMS Titanic would be recovered from the ocean floor in several pieces. The largest piece of the hull that was recovered is a section of the ship's bow, measuring around 25 feet in length and weighing about 15 tons. Other sections of the hull that were recovered include a section of the ship's keel and parts of the ship's stern. The hull sections that were recovered were in poor condition due to the corrosive effects of salt water and the pressure of the deep ocean. They were heavily covered in rust and marine growth, and many of the structural elements had been severely damaged. Despite the poor conditions of the hull sections, they were still able to provide valuable information about the design and construction of the ship. The recovered selections of the hull were also able to provide insight into the damage caused by the collision with the iceberg. Researchers were able to study the impact point on the hull and the damage that was caused by the ice. The damage caused by the collision was consistent with the testimony of its survivors and helped to confirm the official account of the disaster. In addition to providing insight into its design and construction, the recovered sections of the hull also helped to shed light on the events of the disaster itself. The position and condition of the recovered hull sections would help to confirm the official account of the sinking, including the location of the collision and the trajectory of the ship as it sank. The recovered hull sections also helped to answer some of the lingering questions about the disaster. For example, the condition of the recovered sections of the hull would help to confirm that the ship had indeed broken in half before sinking to the bottom, as some survivors had reported. Number 11. Letters recovered. Many letters and postcards would be recovered from the wreckage of the Titanic, providing a glimpse into the lives of the passengers and crew who were on board. Some of those letters by passengers to loved ones back home detailed their experiences on the ship and their plans for their future. Other letters would be written by crew members to their families, describing their work on the ship and their feelings about the voyage. One of the most famous letters that was recovered from the Titanic is a postcard written by Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, to his wife Ida. He wrote the postcard just before the ship hit the iceberg, and it was found in his pocket after the sinking. Another letter is from a passenger named Alexander Oscar Holverson, who wrote to his mother about his experience on the ship and his plans for the future. This letter was found in his pocket after death, and it provided a poignant glimpse into the thoughts and feelings of a man who knew that he was about to die. Overall, the letters and postcards recovered from the Titanic offer a unique glimpse into the lives and experiences of the people on board the ship, and they remain an important part of its historical record of the disaster. Number 12. A pair of binoculars. The pair of binoculars found in the crow's nest of the wreckage of the Titanic is a poignant reminder of the lack of equipment and communication that led to the disaster in the first place. The crow's nest was the location on the ship where the lookouts were stationed, and their job was to keep a watchful eye out for any potential hazards, such as icebergs. It's well known that the binoculars were not being used by the lookouts at the time of the collision. The binoculars were locked in a cupboard, and the key was missing. It's thought that the officer in charge of the lookouts did not provide this key, and this failure to have the binoculars available for use has been considered as one of the main factors that contributed to the disaster, because the lookouts were not able to spot the iceberg in time to avoid the collision. The pair of binoculars, along with other items recovered from the wreckage, serve as a reminder of the lessons that can be learned from the tragedy and the importance of proper equipment and communication in preventing similar disasters from happening in the future. Number 13. A violin belonging to the band leader Wallace Hartley. The violin belonging to Wallace Hartley is a well-known artifact recovered from the wreckage of the ship. Wallace Hartley and his fellow bandmates played music in an effort to calm the passengers as the ship was sinking. It's said that Hartley and his band played the hymn "Nearer, My God, to Thee" as the ship went down. The violin would be recovered with Hartley's body when it was found by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. It was returned to his fiancée Maria Robinson, who then later sold it at an auction. It would later be bought by an anonymous purchaser and was put on display in a number of exhibitions, but its current whereabouts are unknown. The violin has become a symbol of heroism and selflessness of the crew members who stayed on board in order to help others, even as the ship was sinking. It's seen as a reminder of the bravery and sacrifice of Hartley and his fellow band members, who played music to keep the spirits of the passengers high until the very end. The violin is also a reminder of the human tragedy of the Titanic disaster because it serves as a powerful symbol of the lives that were lost and the heroism of those who tried to help others in the face of such a terrible event. Number 14. The wool vest. A wool vest that was recovered from the wreckage of the Titanic is a unique and valuable artifact from one of the most famous shipwrecks in history. The vest is made of high-quality wool and is believed to have belonged to a first-class passenger on the ill-fated voyage. The vest is well preserved and still bears the stains and wear from the fateful night when the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank, taking the lives of over 1,500 people. This wool vest belonged to William Henry Allen, a third-class passenger who died in the disaster. The vest was discovered in his suitcase and appeared pressed and ready to wear at an exhibition preceding the auction of the artifacts in 2012. Allen's dress boots were also recovered from the wreckage. The vest is a physical reminder of the luxury and opulence of the Titanic and the lifestyle of its wealthy passengers. At the time, the Titanic was considered to be the most luxurious and technologically advanced ship in the world, and its passengers were some of the wealthiest and most prominent people of the time. The vest is a testament to the craftsmanship and attention to detail that would go into clothing of that era. The wool vest has become an important historical artifact and is now on display in a museum. The artifact is carefully preserved and protected to keep the memory of the tragic event alive and also to respect the people who lost their lives on the ship. This vest is now a symbol of the luxury and opulence of the ship and its passengers, serving as a reminder of the human tragedy of the disaster while being an important historical artifact that's now on display for everyone to see, carefully preserved and protected over time so that this tragic event may never be forgotten and to respect the people who lost their lives on the ship. Number 15. Set of keys belonging to Samuel Ernest Heming. Another set of keys belonged to Samuel Ernest Heming, a lamp trimmer on the RMS Titanic who survived the disaster and would later testify before the U.S. Senate inquiry into the ship's sinking. Heming had spent his entire life at sea, beginning as a sailor at the age of 15 and then retiring at the age of 43 when the Titanic set sail. A set of Titanic keys would sell for $26,400 at Christie's auction in London, more than doubling their estimate. During the inquiry, he listed his duties as to mix the paint and all that kind of thing for the ship, and to look after all the decks, trim all the lamps, and get them in proper order, and to put the lights in at nighttime and take them off at daybreak. According to his account, the impact of the iceberg woke Heming up, and he discovered air escaping from the exhaust tank. However, reporting this to his chief officer, he then returned to his bunk, unaware of the extent of the ship's damage.